Imagine waking up to silence. Not peace, but the kind of silence that means danger. The river is frozen solid, the trees are stiff with frost, and every breath you take feels like inhaling knives. Your pantry? Empty. Your nearest neighbor? 20 miles away. And the only thing standing between your family and starvation is your knowledge. Knowledge passed down through generations that knew exactly how to turn summer's abundance into winter's survival. That was life for countless Native American tribes. There were no refrigerators humming in the corner, no supermarkets stocked with canned soups and frozen dinners. Everything they ate in January was earned, hunted, or preserved months before. But here's what's incredible: they didn't just survive the cold. They thrived in it. They built an entire science of food preservation using nothing more than wind, sun, smoke, and instinct. While modern people waste tons of food every year, Native communities had zero waste. Every berry, every strip of meat, every grain of corn had a purpose and a plan. And what they discovered centuries ago is so smart that even today survivalists, scientists, and chefs are rediscovering their techniques. If you love stories that prove ancient people were anything but primitive, hit that like button, because what comes next will change how you see your food forever. Let's start with the cornerstone of their genius: turning meat into time itself. When a hunter brought down a deer or bison, it wasn't just a meal, it was a future. Immediately, the tribe got to work, cutting thin strips of meat, removing every trace of fat, and hanging them on wooden racks in the open air. Sunlight and wind became the natural dehydrators, pulling moisture out slowly until the meat was hard and light. Sometimes, small fires burned underneath, their smoke curling through the racks, flavoring the meat and driving away insects. What they created wasn't just jerky, it was insurance. Jerky could last for weeks, even months. It could be eaten dry like a high-protein snack or boiled into rich stews. Hunters could carry pounds of it across miles of plains without spoiling. Imagine the brilliance: transforming something that would rot in days into food that could feed a family for an entire season. No plastic wrap, no preservatives, just pure ingenuity. But even jerky had a weakness. It filled the belly but didn't restore strength after long travel or hard labor. That's where the real magic began. The ultimate survival food, the one explorers later called pemmican. Pemmican was more than food. It was power in a pouch. After drying the meat, women would pound it into a powder using stone mortars. Then came the key ingredient: rendered fat, melted until golden and liquid. Sometimes they added dried berries for vitamins and flavor. The hot fat was mixed with the powdered meat until every particle was sealed away from air and moisture. Finally, the mixture was packed tightly into rawhide bags or small pouches. The result? A dense, portable, calorie-rich superfood that could last for years. It didn't freeze in winter or spoil in summer. You could eat a handful and work all day without hunger. Explorers, fur traders, and even armies copied the recipe. European settlers who thought themselves civilized quickly learned that without pemmican, they wouldn't survive the frontier. Native innovation literally kept them alive. Think about that the next time you grab an energy bar, it's just a modern copy of something invented centuries ago on the plains. If you've ever tried making jerky or preserving food yourself, drop a comment below. You'll be amazed at how much of what we do today was perfected long before electricity ever existed. But meat was only half the story. The real brilliance came from how they worked with plants. Corn, beans, and squash, known as the Three Sisters, were the foundation of life for many tribes. And they didn't just eat them fresh. They knew exactly how to make them last all winter long. Corn was dried right on the cob or shelled and stored in clay pots or underground pits lined with grass and sealed with mud. These natural silos could hold corn for months, even years, safe from pests and moisture. Beans were strung on lines and left to dry in the sun until they rattled like pebbles. Squash was sliced into thin rings and hung like garlands near the fires, drying slowly until the bright orange flesh became light as paper. Each one had a role: corn for carbohydrates, beans for protein, squash for vitamins. Together they formed the perfect survival trio. No fancy diet plan could match that balance. And here's something few people realize: food preservation wasn't just a chore, it was a ritual. When the harvest ended, families gathered to dry, smoke, and store their food. There were songs, prayers, and stories told over the work. Children learned by watching their elders slice meat or hang squash. In those moments, knowledge wasn't written down. It was sung, spoken, and lived. That's the difference between survival and culture. One keeps you alive. The other teaches you why it's worth living. So the next time you hear someone call ancient people primitive, remember this: they built entire food systems that worked without pollution, without chemicals, and without waste. Systems that fed whole nations through blizzards, droughts, and centuries. And we're just getting started. Because drying and smoking were only the beginning. In the next chapter, you'll see how they used smoke, oil, and even fermentation to beat time itself, creating food so well preserved, it could last through years of hardship. But before we get there, if you're still with me, take a second to hit that subscribe button. It helps keep these stories alive and reminds us all that the best survival tools aren't modern gadgets, they're ancient wisdom. If you think smoking was invented for flavor, think again. For Native Americans, smoke wasn't seasoning, it was science. A way to outsmart time, bacteria, and the biting cold of endless winters. When food could mean the difference between life and death, smoke became their invisible armor. Picture this, high racks built from wooden poles hung with strips of meat and fish, the air shimmering with thin trails of blue smoke. Below, small fires burned constantly, never roaring, never dying. They weren't for cooking, they were for preserving. The smoke carried compounds like phenols and formaldehyde that stopped bacteria from growing and coated the meat in a thin, protective film. This wasn't guesswork. It was chemistry centuries before anyone used that word. The smell of a smokehouse wasn't just hunger-inducing, it was the scent of safety. Families could walk past those racks knowing they'd have food in February. Every tribe had its variation. In the Pacific Northwest, salmon was king. During the great salmon runs, entire villages gathered along the rivers. People sang, laughed, and worked side by side, gutting, slicing, and hanging thousands of fish. Smoke rose day and night for weeks, curling between cedar trees like sacred mist. That smoke carried more than food, it carried the future. And when the last fish was dried and packed away, the entire community could rest easy, knowing their survival was sealed in the air itself. But the ingenuity didn't stop at smoke. In some northern coastal tribes, hunters discovered an even more powerful weapon against decay: oil. When meat or fish was fully dried, it could be submerged in rendered seal, whale, or bear fat. It might sound strange, but this oily cocoon blocked air and moisture, keeping the contents perfectly preserved for months, even years. Think of it as the world's first refrigerator, built with nothing more than instinct and resourcefulness. In icy climates, they stored entire cuts of meat or berries and animal fat inside sealskin pouches. These airtight packages could be buried in snow or hung from trees. When the hunters returned from long trips, the food inside was still rich, flavorful, and safe. What modern freezers do with electricity, they achieved with physics, patience, and nature's own design. And it wasn't only about the food. The act of preserving meat and fat held deep spiritual meaning. Before sealing a batch, many tribes performed small offerings: a pinch of meat to the fire, a whisper to the spirits, gratitude to the animal that gave its life. It wasn't superstition. It was respect. An acknowledgement that survival was never a solo effort, but a partnership between people and nature. If you're enjoying this journey into ancient ingenuity, take a second right now to hit like. It's the digital version of adding wood to the fire. It keeps the story burning. Now let's talk about something most people never associate with ancient America: fermentation. Modern science calls it biochemistry. The ancients called it wisdom. Long before the first microscopes, Native Americans learned that letting certain foods rest transformed them into something better. Safer, more nutritious, and longer lasting. Take corn for instance. In the Great Plains and the Southwest, tribes soaked and fermented corn to make it easier to digest and more nourishing. This process, similar to nixtamalization, broke down tough plant fibers and released vital nutrients. The result was hominy, soft, filling, and perfect for storing or turning into meal for winter cooking. Further north, in icy regions where fishing was life, fermentation became an art form. Hunters buried fish or seal meat underground, wrapped in grass or seaweed. The slow, natural fermentation produced a strong, pungent food that could last through months of darkness. It wasn't about taste, it was about endurance. Those who could handle the smell knew it was a promise of survival when nothing else remained edible. Even berries had their own secret transformation. In some regions, they were left to lightly ferment, creating mildly alcoholic drinks rich in calories and preserved sugars, a kind of natural energy tonic. Without meaning to, they had discovered probiotics and energy storage centuries before the words even existed. Fermentation was more than clever, it was adaptable. Each region used what it had. From the humid forests of the southeast to the frozen tundra of the Arctic, native communities transformed their environments into living laboratories. Their equipment wasn't glass jars and thermometers, it was soil, wood, hide, and time. And here's what's truly remarkable. These methods didn't destroy nutrients like modern industrial processing often does. They enhanced them. Smoke added antibacterial compounds. Fermentation created vitamins. Fat preserved calories. Together, they turned fragile harvests into a buffet that could last the year. It's hard not to feel humbled by that level of understanding. No waste. No chemicals. No dependence on machines. Just people, fire, wind, and knowledge passed down through the centuries. And this knowledge wasn't secret. It was shared, celebrated, and taught. Food preservation wasn't a job. It was a community event. Picture the scene. After a big bison hunt, the camp would erupt in activity. Men cut and cleaned, women rendered fat, children carried wood for the fires. The sound of scraping hides mixed with laughter and storytelling. That's something modern life has lost. The rhythm of working together for survival. Back then, food wasn't just eaten. It was honored, sung over, and remembered. Every preserved strip of meat was a story, a reminder that someone cared enough to ensure no one went hungry. And that's why when European traders and explorers stumbled into these camps, they were astonished. They saw not primitive savages, but master engineers of sustenance. They copied what they saw, drying, smoking, sealing, and carried it into the fur trade and frontier life. In fact, if you've ever used jerky, smoked fish, or canned food on a road trip or hike, you're continuing a tradition that started centuries before you were born. So the next time someone tells you that ancient people lived hand to mouth, you can tell them this. Native Americans didn't just eat what they could find. They built one of the most advanced, sustainable food systems the world has ever seen. One based on respect, precision, and survival. And hey, if this story is sparking something in you, share it with someone who loves history or survival wisdom. The more people know how our ancestors thrived, the more we all remember what true resilience looks like. When the first frost hardened the soil and rivers glazed over with ice, the game of survival began for real. Hunting slowed, plants vanished, and every mistake could cost a life. Yet for Native American families, this was not chaos, it was strategy. They had already prepared for this moment months in advance, transforming the landscape itself into a living pantry. Every valley, hill, and forest held hidden reserves of food waiting quietly under snow and earth. What looked like wilderness was, in truth, a perfectly organized network of storage and survival. Across vast territories, from the Great Plains to the forests of the Northeast, tribes developed intricate underground caches that worked like natural refrigerators. These were not random pits. They were crafted with precision and knowledge of terrain, soil, and air circulation. Hunters and gatherers knew that high, dry ground was best. Digging into low areas risked flooding, but on an incline or ridge, the earth stayed firm and breathable. Inside the pit, they layered dried grasses, bark, or woven reeds, creating insulation that absorbed moisture and prevented rot. Then came the treasure: corn, beans, squash, nuts, roots, each layered separately and sometimes sealed with clay or packed earth. These caches could keep food safe for months, sometimes for years. The soil's natural coolness acted as a temperature regulator, while its darkness kept out the light that could trigger decay. In regions where winters were fierce, the insulation was so effective that stored food often emerged in spring as fresh as the day it was buried. It was an invisible science, a collaboration between human foresight and the physics of the earth itself. But the real brilliance lay in how these storage pits became part of the land's memory. Nomadic tribes, such as the Plains peoples, marked secret caches along migration routes, feeding stations hidden beneath their own footprints. They didn't rely on maps or written directions. Instead, they memorized the shapes of rocks, the bend of a tree, or the feel of the ground beneath their feet. Months later, they would return to that same place, scrape away the topsoil, and find food waiting exactly where they had left it. This was not luck. It was generational intelligence encoded in oral tradition. In the forests of the Great Lakes, families often stored food collectively. Entire villages gathered at the end of harvest season to fill dozens of pits with dried corn, beans, and seeds. Each pit might hold hundreds of pounds of food, enough to feed a community through months of deep snow. These were communal safety nets long before the idea of food banks ever existed. And when the first snow fell, families knew that beneath the frozen ground, their future was safe. Above the ground, other tribes turned storage into art and architecture. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest built small clay granaries into cliff sides, where the dry desert air and shade of the rock naturally preserved corn and seeds. The clay absorbed excess moisture by day and released it at night, maintaining a steady, dry environment. Some of these cliff granaries are still intact centuries later, a testament to their creator's genius. In wetter regions, the solution looked entirely different. Along the coasts and river valleys, birch bark and cedar became the main tools of preservation. Birch bark baskets sealed with resin were lightweight yet waterproof, perfect for storing berries, dried fish, or ground meal. Cedar's natural oils repelled insects and fungus, allowing it to serve as a kind of organic anti-mold material. The scent of cedar, still used today in closets and chests, was once the guardian of entire harvests. And then there were the raised granaries, wooden platforms built several feet above ground, their small huts supported by stilts and accessed by ladders. These clever designs kept food safe from rodents and ground moisture while allowing wind to flow freely underneath, keeping everything cool and dry. To anyone passing by, they might have looked like small watchtowers or shrines, but to those who built them, they were vaults of life. Timing, however, was everything. Knowing when to harvest was just as crucial as knowing how to store. Corn that was picked too early would spoil. Beans harvested too late would lose their nutrients. Elders taught that the moon and the insects spoke if you knew how to listen. When crickets quieted or the first geese flew south, the time had come to seal the pits and close the season. They followed nature's cues, not calendars. Every motion, from drying squash to sealing baskets, was synchronized with the rhythm of the land. For them, food storage was never a mechanical process. It was a spiritual conversation. Before sealing a cache, families offered a handful of corn or a slice of squash back to the earth, whispering gratitude for its generosity. These acts weren't superstition. They were humility in practice, a reminder that taking required giving. Children learned early that storing food was both work and worship. The mothers and grandmothers who taught these skills were as revered as warriors, for their wisdom kept the tribe alive long after the last arrow was fired. Even their sense of innovation didn't stop at tradition. When metal tools, cloth, or trade goods arrived from Europe, tribes adapted their preservation systems with remarkable speed. Metal pots replaced some clay vessels, allowing for tighter seals. Oiled fabric and animal skins lined baskets to improve waterproofing. But the principle never changed: preservation through balance, patience, and respect for natural cycles. What's astonishing is that many of these methods still work. Archaeologists have unearthed storage pits over 1,000 years old that still contain dried seeds, intact and viable for germination. Think about that: food so well preserved it could give life again after centuries underground. That isn't just survival, it's continuity. When you stand back and look at it all, the underground caches, the raised granaries, the bark baskets, the rituals of offering, you begin to see something bigger than just clever preservation. This was civilization built on sustainability, a blueprint for how to live within limits and still flourish. They didn't waste. They didn't hoard. They prepared, protected, and shared. It's a lesson our modern world could desperately use. Because today, when millions of tons of food are thrown away every year, we've forgotten what it means to truly value a meal. The ancient way wasn't just about feeding the body, it was about feeding gratitude, patience, and community. If this part of the story inspired you, take a moment to hit subscribe and keep it alive. These aren't just tales of the past, they're instructions for the future, written in the soil beneath our feet. Long before maps divided the continent or trains carved their way through its heart, the first trade networks of North America already existed, silent, vast, and sustained by something far more essential than gold. They were built on food. On carefully dried meat, on jars of seeds, on baskets of smoked fish sealed with fat. For Native Americans, food was not just nourishment, it was connection, a bridge between tribes, a language of trust, and the first true currency of the land. Food preservation, at its core, was the science that made civilization possible. It turned a fleeting harvest into a lasting resource, and a local surplus into something worth trading. Among the Iroquois Confederacy, vast stores of dried corn, beans, and squash, the Three Sisters, filled clay pots and underground pits, feeding not only their own families but neighboring nations. These foods traveled along forest trails and river routes, traded for salt, hides, flint, and pottery. And every exchange was more than a transaction. It was a promise, a silent agreement that life could flourish through cooperation. In the Great Plains, this same wisdom took a new form. Hunters who once followed herds of bison across endless grasslands found a way to turn fleeting abundance into portable power: pemmican. This remarkable mixture of powdered meat, melted fat, and dried berries wasn't just a meal. It was an invention that changed the map. A small bag of pemmican could sustain a hunter for days. Stored properly, it lasted for years. Entire expeditions, including the fur traders of the Hudson's Bay Company, would later depend on it. They called it the food of the North. Without it, the trade routes that connected the frozen tundra to the Atlantic ports might never have existed. But before the Europeans learned its value, Pemmican had already sustained countless generations of native hunters and families. It symbolized foresight and endurance, food as a living memory. Each batch was prepared with care and respect. The women who rendered the fat and pounded the meat weren't just cooks. They were scientists, engineers, and guardians of continuity. Their knowledge made survival predictable in a land that could turn cruel overnight. Farther north, in the Arctic, the Inuit transformed an unforgiving landscape into a kingdom of adaptation. Their environment offered no fertile soil, yet they thrived. Their caches, stone chambers dug into permafrost, kept fish, seal, and whale meat frozen naturally all year round. Whale blubber, rendered into oil, became not only a light source but also a sealant and preservative. Fermentation, often misunderstood by outsiders, was a deliberate, sophisticated method that made nutrients more accessible during the long dark months when the sun barely rose. These techniques, born from necessity, were as scientific as any refrigeration system today. What made all these systems extraordinary was their harmony. Each method, whether it involved drying meat, fermenting berries, or burying food underground, worked with nature, not against it. Native peoples didn't attempt to conquer the environment. They studied it, respected it, and moved with its rhythms. They learned how moisture traveled through soil, how cold air pooled in valleys, how the first frost signaled not death but preservation. Over time, they built entire philosophies around these observations. In their eyes, storing food was as sacred as planting it. Ceremony intertwined with science. When a community sealed its final cache for the year, it wasn't a quiet affair. Songs echoed across the valleys. Fires burned as families gathered to give thanks to the spirits of the harvest. Before placing the last basket underground, elders often sprinkled a few grains of corn or pieces of dried meat as an offering. It was a way of saying, "We remember this gift." These rituals weren't superstition. They were gratitude made visible. Every offering acknowledged the truth that survival was never achieved alone. Even food distribution followed moral laws. In many tribes, the first harvest or the best preserved foods were set aside for elders, pregnant women, or the sick. Sharing wasn't an act of charity, it was structure. The community thrived as one body, every member a vital part of the whole. This was food security in its purest form, built on empathy, equality, and foresight. Over centuries, the same principles gave rise to vast trade systems connecting people thousands of miles apart. From the salmon-smoking villages of the Pacific Northwest to the cornfields of the Mississippi Valley and the pemmican makers of the plains, all were linked by the flow of preserved foods. Canoes traveled loaded with smoked fish and dried berries. Horse caravans carried fat-sealed meat and baskets of beans. The exchange of food soon became the exchange of ideas. Recipes, rituals, and stories passed along with each trade, weaving the continent together long before European contact. What's fascinating is that this primitive technology often surpassed what came later. Archaeologists have unearthed cache pits still containing edible remnants after centuries underground. The chemistry of smoke, the airtight seal of rendered fat, the microbial balance of natural fermentation, all of these were solutions modern science would only rediscover generations later. Today, as we speak of sustainability, zero waste, and renewable living, we find ourselves circling back to what native peoples already perfected hundreds of years ago. Their approach to preservation was, in truth, an approach to life. It taught patience, discipline, and humility. It reminded every person, from the youngest child gathering herbs to the oldest elder sealing a pot, that the future depended on what they did today. Every grain stored, every meal shared, every act of restraint became an act of respect. The tragedy, of course, is that much of this wisdom was nearly erased. Colonization disrupted ancient food systems, replacing harmony with industrial efficiency. Yet, even in the face of forced displacement and famine, these traditions endured. In modern indigenous communities, many of these methods are returning. Young people smoking fish as their ancestors did, elders teaching how to dig cache pits, families fermenting berries under the northern lights. It's not just nostalgia. It's revival, a quiet act of resistance and pride. There's a certain poetry in that. The same food that once sustained nations now sustains memory. Each recipe preserved today keeps a language alive, a worldview intact, a connection to land renewed. Because what Native Americans mastered was never just how to survive, but why. They saw preservation as love, love for the next generation, for the earth that provided, for the wisdom of those who came before. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. Technology may change, tools may evolve, but true resilience always begins with gratitude. These people didn't store food out of fear, they did it out of faith, faith in the cycle of seasons, in their skill, and in the living world that sustained them. If this story made you stop and think, take a second to honor it, not with silence but with curiosity. Learn one of these techniques. Try drying your own fruit or building a small smoker. The past is not gone, it's waiting to be remembered. And before you go, subscribe to keep these stories alive. Every time you share or comment, you're helping protect not just knowledge but a way of seeing the world. One that values balance over greed and respect over excess. Native Americans turned survival into civilization, and their genius still whispers through the soil, the rivers, and the smoke rising from every campfire. Their food didn't just fill stomachs. It built nations, strengthened friendships, and carried hope across generations. And that, perhaps, is the greatest form of preservation of all.